Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're taking a look at Islamic growth, the establishment of different caliphates, with special emphasis on what happened to Islam as it spread outside of the Arab Peninsula. So, let's get started. When we take a look at the Islamic empires of faith, there's a special word to know, and that word is caliphate. A caliph is the secular and religious head of both the faith and the secular version of the state. So this is a very powerful institution. And Muhammad himself had the concept that Islam needed to grow with the state. They both needed to grow together. So with the growth of this concept of the faith for the community, the Ummah, it eventually evolved into this larger idea of a caliphate. And two big early caliphates to look at. First off is the Umayyad Caliphate, which is depicted here, controlling a very large area and influencing an even larger one. And then the Abbasid Caliphate depicted here. And this map I like quite a bit more, specifically because it shows the main way Islam was able to spread so quickly, and that was the trade routes. It's worth pointing out again that those trade routes are the ways that Islam was able to grow so quickly. From the Silk Road that led out of China into the Middle East, the Near East, Islam spread all along it. In the same way that Buddhism spread from India to China, Islam spread across these routes. A significant early ruler of the Abbasid Caliphate was Harun al-Rashid, and this guy was really golden age ruler status. When you put those words together, what you're thinking, this guy is it. He rules, it's a time of peace, time of prosperity, and growth. And that's not just the faith that's growing, or the religion that's growing, or the state that's growing. It's also the notions of mankind's cultural contributions, science, art, music. All of this is happening. During his rule, the best library in probably the world was constructed, the Biyat al-Hakimah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad, and it would be the best library in the world until the Mongols showed up. At this time, the Persian Empire, the old Persian Empire, had kind of been routed under the Caliphate, and the old royal advisors of Persia would become the new royal advisors to the Caliph. And in this case, these advisors were in a principal position of authority and influence when things started to shift. And when things do shift, they would be there. When Harun al-Rashid died, there was a power struggle between his two sons, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun. And they fought specifically because the throne was originally intended to go to Al-Amin. He had been groomed since childhood to be caliph, but when Harun al-Rashid was near death, he had a fever dream that if Al-Amin had come to power, things would have gone very bad very quickly for everybody. So, with days left alive and sick, Harun al-Rashid changed his will, and Al-Mamun became caliph. And this power struggle was more than just sibling rivalry. This was also the question of what was said Al-Amin's entire life versus what happened as al-Rashid was dying. And Al-Amin did not give up the idea of power easily, and he established himself in a quasi-caliph status in Baghdad. This was something that just fundamentally, for the functioning of the state, could not last. There could only be one caliph. And even though these two were brothers, it had to be decided one way, and it was decided through this war. It ends with Al-Mamun laying siege to the city of Baghdad, capturing his brother, and then killing his brother. Now, this was both popular and not popular thing to do. So Al-Mamun creates this idea of a slave army the slave that could defend the king. It grew to be a personal guard, a personal entourage and bodyguard of 4,000 individuals. And if you were a slave, this was not the worst position you could be in. Now, it was not exclusive that these were all slaves, and there was definitely a lot of oversight, because the idea of arming your slaves does have a big problem. And it led to the development of the Mercenary Army. Mercenaries are soldiers who don't fight for patriotism, they fight for the dollar. And this was something that you could deploy relatively quickly whenever you wanted, and most mercenaries were constantly highly trained. This is a little bit more expensive than a standing army, but by no means is it a money-saving option. The people weren't happy with this because a lot of people viewed the mercenaries as outsiders. The people are unhappy, and, well, the mercenaries cost a lot of money. This caused tax money to go up. The caliphs that follow Harun al-Rashid start building a lot, and not necessarily for the betterment of all people. This is going to cause a big burden on taxes and taxpayers. When your tax money that you have to pay to the state goes up by so much, by so quickly, most people had to find a new way to make money. And being a farmer was something that was not economically feasible. So farmers start doing other things so they can make more money, so they can pay these taxes. But that means that there's not as much food. This leads to an agricultural breakdown, and then a larger social breakdown, and then an imperial breakdown. It's just the dominoes that are a fall. When we take a look at the Islamic empires of faith, there's a special word to know, and that word is caliphate. A caliph is the secular and religious head of both the faith and the secular version of the state. So this is a very powerful institution. And Muhammad himself had the concept that Islam needed to grow with the state. They both needed to grow together. So with the growth of this concept of the faith for the community, the Ummah, it eventually evolved into this larger idea of a caliphate. And two big early caliphates to look at. First off is the Umayyad Caliphate, which is depicted here, controlling a very large area and influencing an even larger. Over time, the continued focus of growing the caliph wealthy and spending money to do this had drawn attention away from the border and more towards the internal Islamic heartland. And that led to nomadic incursions, which ultimately left the Abbasid caliphs to be defeated by these Persian boyards. And they take over the Abbasid Caliphate by this point. They take on the role of sultan, but they then are ousted about a century later by the Seljuk Turks. These were nomads from Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, and it's very important to point out that even though they were Muslim, they were super staunch Sunnis. They detested the difference between Sunnism and Shiaism, and were so fervent about this that they would go on to kill a large number of Shia groups. This group would also eventually be responsible for fighting the Byzantine Empire and winning time and time again. This group would be responsible for indirectly starting the Crusades, and this group would go on to fight the Egyptian Shias quite successfully. When Harun al-Rashid died, there was a power struggle between his two sons, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, and they fought specifically because the throne was originally intended to go to Al-Amin. He had been groomed since childhood to be caliph, but when Harun al-Rashid was near death, he had a fever dream that if Al-Amin had come to power, things would have gone very bad very quickly for everybody. So, with days left alive and sick, Harun al-Rashid changed his will, and Al-Mamun became caliph. And this power struggle was more than just sibling rivalry. This was also the question of what was said Alaman's entire life. As far as an age of learning goes, this was big. We see that the Greek inventions of algebra and geometry are kind of getting fixed at this time. It's not like there's big problems, but getting stronger math happens because of the Arab scholars in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, and even the basic concepts of trig are showing up at this time. Chemistry shows ideas of how to classify things as well as weighing different minerals, and hospitals start showing up. The role of a doctor having to take a test and pass an exam before they were allowed to practice, the thing that happens now everywhere in the West. That was started by Arab physicians in the 10th century, and that role would grow. Slowly, especially in Western Europe, it would take centuries for this idea to start to really catch on. As Islam continued to expand, we see there's a new push for how to expand, and a couple of new rules on how to do this. The first one was the Sufis. They believed that there needed to be some mysticism in Islam that kind of jazz it up a little bit, get it exciting for new groups of people. The ulama were super conservative Orthodox Muslims who thought any outside influence was a dangerous heretical threat, to the extent that even Greek rationalism was seen as a threat, and they were less likely to accept introduction of change. The contrast to the group known as the ulama was Al-Ghazali. He was a theologian who tried to blend rationalism and religious doctrine. And his views were largely rejected, but he did start making arguments that it's okay to think about these things. The connection I make with him would be with Thomas Aquinas, the medieval monk who did roughly the same thing in By about 1200, Muslim rule across much of the northern, central, Persian empires started leading it into South Asia, most infamously India. And these groups are going to start to interact very quickly and very interestingly, because Islam and Hindu have a lot of contrasts. Islam is monotheistic, Hindu is polytheistic. Hinduism has the caste, Islam has the idea that everyone is equal, and it's really interesting that these dichotomies, so much so that most people who are going to want to convert from Hinduism to Islam are those people in the lower caste, those who do not see an out happening in their lifetime, or probably the next couple dozen lifetimes. Lower caste individuals are more likely to convert to Islam, but higher caste Hindus are more likely to flat out reject it. And again, this goes back to the role of the caste system. As Islamic culture starts interacting with India, the work that Indian scholars had been doing continued to interact as well with Arabic. And we see that these two groups are going to pass information and skills and knowledge back and forth. The coming of Islam to Southeast Asia was a little more complicated and a little bit longer. It really spread to this reason because of the Sufi mystics. With Indonesia, it was the same idea that we had seen in India. The only difference is in Indonesia, it was the elites who converted, not the average person. And that was really surprising, especially when you consider that now Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. The only thing that it could fight with was Buddhism. So, that's everything I've got to share with you today about Islamic growth outside of the Arab Peninsula. I hope you learned something, and have a nice day.